My wife is fun-loving, adventurous, and very family-oriented. Or, at least, she was before this all began. Very early in our relationship, she made it clear how important having a family was to her. This scared me a little bit, but I wasn't opposed to kids, and we had such a great time together. We hiked, camped, biked, and simply enjoyed being outdoors. Sometimes she would daydream out loud about what it would be like to do all those things with a child of our own and to share all their new experiences with them. We ended up moving in together about a year after we started dating, and I was working 2 part-time jobs while she was working a full-time night shift job as well as attending college in the morning. We had no time and were barely making ends meet for a while there. COVID was her senior year of college, and I was one of the lucky few who got the opportunity to advance in my career due to the pandemic. We got married and saved all of our extra cash and were fortunate enough to buy a house while the market was still way too hot. It was definitely a fixer-upper, and it's still presently a work in progress, but it was our own place to do with as we pleased. 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. We imagined what life might look like with those rooms filled. Then, we had our first son. Postpartum was a hard season, as neither of us slept much with a newborn, and my wife struggled with postpartum depression, but after the first month and a half, we had longer bouts of sleep and some actual time for our little family. We live in a state where both parents get 3 months off, paid, for bonding with the new child, so my wife set up a handful of trips, and as a family of 3, we hiked and camped and went to the beach. It was great and felt akin to the beginning of our relationship. Those months went by fast. Soon we were back to the slog of full-time jobs, and now navigating daycare drop-offs and pickups. Where we would normally sleep in on the weekends, we now were up early with our baby. Sometimes this led to tension, but mostly we handled it well, and the love we share for our son outweighed any of the inconveniences to our day-to-day lives. It's an adjustment period for sure, though, as you continually practice putting the needs of another being above your own. But it's so rewarding. Our baby boy turned 1, and my wife wanted to begin trying for another baby. I had no complaints with that request. That experience was much different than the first. This time, it took many months and doctor appointments and blood draws and pills. We grew apart as my wife would go from hopeful one week to deeply distraught the next. She'd spend a day curled up in bed instead of out in the yard, playing with her baby she already had. I felt that she was being ungrateful, but I'm not a woman, and it's not my body, so the understanding was lacking. This caused a rift between us some days. Months passed, and it was Christmas Day. Like many wives, mine does the heavy lifting when it comes to the holidays. There were several packages neatly wrapped under the tree, and stockings on the mantel were filled to the brim. I didn't know what was in the majority of it. She recorded our son opening his gifts for his second Christmas. It was great watching his little face light up with each new toy or candy or article of clothing. Though, the wrapping paper was his actual favorite. My wife then pointed the camera at me and told me to open my stocking. I pulled out a few thoughtful gifts, too much candy, and what I thought was some sort of marker, but it wasn't. It was a pregnancy test with 2 pink lines in the test window. I started to cry and we embraced. She sent the video clip to her friends and family as the Christmas morning announcement. We were really happy. The ultrasounds were my wife's favorite appointments with our first son, and she made a little paperclip chain on the calendar to count down the days until we got to see this new, little life for the first time. The guys at my work gave me some grief about needing an extra long lunch that day to be able to make the appointment. It was important to my wife, and since I can't feel what she feels, it's a connected point to have the visual of what's going on inside of her. It was the same doctor she had seen with our first, in the same ultrasound room. The same gel on her lower abdomen, and reclining back on the same chair. She was more relaxed this time, expectant of what we were about to see. But it wasn't the same. The gestational sac was there, and a small lump lay still, not bouncing and kicking like our first. My wife's smile faded, and I took the rest of the day off to head home and be with her. Her mom watched our son. The miscarriage wasn't natural. The baby, our second son, had to be surgically removed. My wife was incredibly distraught and had grasped onto the little shred of hope that there may be signs of life, requesting an ultrasound prior to the procedure. He remained right where he'd been. The doctor talked to me while she was still asleep. Decay on the tiny body had already begun to take place, which could have been very dangerous for my wife. This solidified, for me, that this was the right choice, but my wife recoiled at that detail when I told it to her later. She had a few days of pretty intense pain, but made a full physical recovery. Mentally was a different story. There were several nights, after we put our son to bed, that my wife would lock herself in the bathroom and sob. Loud, breathy sobs, where she couldn't have answered me verbally if she wanted to. I would ask her to let me in, to be with her, to hold her, but she had none of it. She wanted to be alone. So, I left her alone. I thought that might help. But when her bathroom sessions ended, she'd come at me vehemently. "What are you even doing? Did you even care? What's the matter with you?" I tried to explain how I was also processing this loss, but at the same time, trying to care for her and our son. I think she actually hated me. She no longer came to bed with me, but opted for the couch. I tried to show my care by covering her up with her favorite fuzzy blanket and placing her water bottle on the side table to encourage her to drink something. She'd at least oblige me and take a sip. Aside from the week off after her procedure, she still went to work, dropped off and picked up our son, and made dinner. She was still keeping up daytime routines and childcare, but when our son went to bed, she turned back into the disheveled, sad lump on the couch. We live above a graveyard, and sometimes take our son to the little pond there to feed the ducks and geese. But that day, my wife took our son to the little burial plot where our second child was being put to rest. I do regret that I didn't get the day off, but I didn't know how to process it all, and if I'm being honest, it felt a bit more grandiose than it needed to be. Miscarriages aren't uncommon, sadly. But it turned out none of the family could make it. Maybe they were actually too busy, or maybe they shared my sentiments, who knows. Regardless, my wife was there, with our son, some strangers, and a pastor who gave a nice speech about the tiny little body in the tiny little box. I got a picture of flowers on the graveside, and my wife didn't say much else to me. I tried to apologize, but she wouldn't have it, and I can't say I blame her. I wouldn't have guessed that no one else would make it, but that's just shifting the blame. That night, I had stayed up late, and I'd gone to check on her before I got into bed. She lay in what looked like a terribly uncomfortable position, but the soft snoring confirmed she was asleep. I covered her with her blanket and turned off the lamp. I made my way out of the living room into the bathroom to get myself ready for bed. When I opened the bathroom door, I jumped back with a shout. She was just standing there, in the hall, staring at the wall. "What are you doing?" "I thought you were asleep." "You scared me." "Nothing." She didn't acknowledge me at all. I'm prone to the occasional sleepwalking episode, and given all the physical and emotional stress she was under, I figured it was completely plausible that she was having an episode herself. "Come on, hon, let's get you back to bed." She turned her head immediately and met my eyes. "No. I'm sorry, I thought you were sleepwalking." We stood there for too much time, her eyes locked on mine with such an intensity. Anger? Resentment? Disdain? All of the above? Finally, I just exasperatedly told her, "I'm really sorry. I'm sorry this happened. I'm sorry I missed the burial. I'm sorry you're going through this. What do you want me to do? I really don't know how to help you here." But she just stared, unblinking, until she finally turned around and went to curl back up on the couch. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much, and I could feel the space between us growing wider. The next day, she got up like normal and was fully in her work mom mode. She didn't really acknowledge me, but that wasn't unusual since all of this had started. I was just glad that she was talking and tending to our son. It was nice to hear her voice in a semi-normal manner. We went to work, came home, she had dinner on the table, I cleaned up, and we put our son to bed together. She was still awake when I came to see her before bed, but she kept her face buried in her phone. I said, "Good night," and continued on my way. I also fell into the phone trap before going to sleep. My back was turned to the door as I scrolled mindlessly through reels. Eventually, I turned the phone off and rolled to switch off the lamp and startled again. She was right there, standing at my bedside, not saying a word. "Honey, don't scare me like that. Are you coming to bed tonight? Here, let me fix the pillows." She continued in her silence and didn't move towards the bed. "Are you coming to bed?" I repeated to no avail. This time, her eyes were right on mine, but seemed to be looking past me. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw nothing. "Hon, we really need to get to bed. It's a work night." But she wouldn't leave, and I couldn't sleep with her looming over me like that. I seriously didn't know what to do, but what I decided on probably wasn't the right choice. I sat up, with no movement from her still, and I wrapped my arms around her waist, picking her up in one quick motion. She began kicking violently and punched at my back. That actually hurt. I exclaimed, dropping her. "Don't touch me," she hissed. "I need to go to bed." "You need to go to bed. You've got to go somewhere." Her face went back to deadpan, and she continued to just stand there. "I'm serious." My voice raised as I was reaching my wit's end. "Tomorrow isn't promised," she said flatly, and finally turned to head back to the couch. My elevated emotions kept me awake for some time after she'd left. To my dismay, this became a trend. I'd get ready for bed, and at some point between the bathroom visit and turning off the lamp, she'd appear, wordless and staring off into space. Sometimes at me, sometimes at a wall or an object. I started to just ignore her and eventually could manage sleep despite her presence. I mentioned therapy, but she was uninterested. She blamed the price, and I told her that we would manage and it was important for all of us. She still refused. I tried to let it go, since it wasn't affecting our son, but even under the circumstances, this was obviously not normal. She had become very depressed after the birth of our first son, and I knew she had gone through the same hormone dump, but without the baby this time. So, I just tried to rationalize it as best as I could. The internet said it would take a few weeks for our hormone levels to get back to normal, but we were well past a few weeks. I felt helpless. For me. For her. For the whole situation. I chose to call her mom and didn't go into details, but just let her know that her daughter was not doing very well mentally. Apparently, she hadn't shown any alarming behavior to the rest of the family. Just the normal motions of grief that one might expect. Her mom came and took her on a little outing, and my wife seemed to be in a better mood when she got back. She'd gotten a gift for our son, and they played together until it was time for bed. She didn't say much to me, but for the first time in weeks, she got into her bed. There was such a huge sense of relief. I'd done the right thing. Things were going to get better from here. I had vivid nightmares that night, and I woke up in a cold sweat. To my horror, as adrenaline was already high, I saw that my wife had rolled towards me with her large eyes and blank expression. Thinking maybe I'd scared her, I told her I had a nightmare, but she continued to stare and say nothing. "Great, whatever," I said, rolling back over her. It was better anyways to have her staring at me from in the bed rather than standing over it. Probably due to already having a nightmare, I just couldn't shake the feeling of her watching me. I tossed and turned and kind of hoped she'd leave the bed, but she didn't. So much for better. The next morning, I got up for work and she was still asleep. This was not super unusual, so I went on my way, groggily. By the time I was actually ready to leave for work, our son was up and running around, but my wife still hadn't left the bed. I went in to gently nudge her. "Hey, I need to leave for work. Baby's awake, so I need you to get up." I can't even emphasize how angry her eyes were as she began waking up. Irritated by the dagger she shot my way, after all, she was the one who had kept us both up the night before, I went back to the living room and got our son a cup of milk and put on a TV show for him. I waited for my wife to emerge, but she didn't. The clock was ticking. I went back to the bedroom, and she was in the bed staring. She didn't look at me, but just blankly stared at the wall. This behavior hadn't translated to the morning before this, and I had no time to wait for her to come out of it. From all of our night experiences, I knew there was no time frame for this, and we both needed to leave for work. I snapped my fingers in front of her expressionless eyes. We need to get to work. We do not have time for whatever this is. She didn't budge. I walked forward and put my hand on her shoulder, but before I could take back that action, she bit me. She drew blood. "Oh, what are you doing?" I cried, and at that point I heard the quick, little footsteps of our son running to see what was happening. Shit. 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 Clutching the bite, I turned out and closed the door behind me before our child could witness his mom, the feral animal. "What happened, Dad?" he asked so innocently. "Where's Mama?" "Mama's still sleeping, but I told her she has to get up because Dad has to go to work." "Oh, okay." And he walked back out to the living room. The absolute trust he had in us both was both astounding and terrifying. I went to the bathroom to wash my hand, blood running down the white porcelain. You could clearly see where her teeth had each individually pierced the skin. I grabbed a large bandage and covered it up the best I could. Then, she came out of the room. In her work clothes, back to normal, like none of this even happened. "No, we need to talk about this." "What the hell was that?" "This is not something we're just shoving under the rug." She didn't even acknowledge me. She just brushed past me and began brushing her teeth and putting her hair up. "You can't do that to me. You can't be like this around our son. This is not okay. Don't touch me." Stated very coldly, but at least I got words out of her. "I'm sorry for grabbing your shoulder, but I need you to tell me that this behavior will stop." "I don't know what to do." Back to no response. She walked out of the bathroom and greeted our son, and I arrived to work late. I was so worried about what the night would hold that I chose to stay at work longer than normal. She never got into that crazy state before putting our son to bed, but a side of me recognized how unpredictable this behavior was becoming. I decided to head home a half hour before bedtime. Dinner would be done, I could step right into the cleanup, and we could all do story time after that. Like a normal family. Much like the ultrasound of our second, what I expected was not what I saw. "Hello? Are you two in here? Baby? Please, answer me." No noise. An empty house. Nothing was out of place or riffled through, and my wife's car was still parked in the driveway. I dialed my wife's number, and I could hear her phone vibrating in the other room. I ran over there, but it just lay on the bed. No way to call her or track her location. I began my search on foot. Maybe it was just an innocent after-dinner walk. Except it was dark now, and our road had no streetlights. In fact, with the whole expanse of graveyard behind our house, the whole thing is very dark and encased in the trees and shrubbery growing along its border. Walking turned into jogging as each minute passed without me finding them. I went up and down the main road, down side roads, around the whole perimeter of the graveyard. There was no sign of them. The entrance to the graveyard was locked. I rattled the iron gate to see if it would budge, to no avail. The fence was lower on the east side, but I couldn't imagine how she might possibly get her son over the fence along with herself, but where else could she be? Looking down the street for witnesses, and seeing none, I was able to climb over it without much issue. I began running through the graves. The grounds had rolling, grassy hills, lots of plant life, large trees littered throughout, and a central pond. It was very picturesque in the day, but the darkness made it feel vaster at night. Shadows cast by plants moved with the breeze and would act as camouflage for a shadow from the living. I went section by section. Angry honks and flapping wings made me fall backwards as I made it to the pond. The dumb geese had now made my presence known to anyone and everyone, whether that be good or bad. Running through the birds, I kept moving. I wished now more than ever that I attended the burial. Up a hill and rounding a corner, I saw a very large tree, easily wide enough to hide behind. I could see small objects dangling from it, but couldn't make out exactly what they were. I slowed my pace and tried to be as quiet as possible as I approached. They were little toys, strings grown into the branches, obviously put there long ago. the section of child and infant graves. Getting as close to the tree as possible, I peered around it, and at the far end of the section I could make out a figure with a smaller one beside it, but they were both very still. Toddlers are not still creatures. The hair raised on the back of my neck. Should I sprint to them? Should I try to sneak my way over? Before I could choose my next move, my wife's head turned and she stared right at me, from across the whole entire section. I shuddered, but decided to sprint for them. She didn't run. She stayed in her spot, our son with her. He was holding her hand. Why wasn't he looking towards me? Why wasn't he acknowledging the hurried steps coming right toward him? What had she done to him? I snatched him and lunged back, out of her arm's length, prepared to run again, but she still didn't move. She glared, unblinking, her unnerving stare only partially covered by her disheveled hair. Squatting down, breathless, I finally noticed that our son was staring blankly at a tiny headstone engraved with our last name and only one date. I wrapped my arms around him, but his eyes stayed transfixed to that spot, and he still said nothing. What did you do to him? I demanded. The ghostly remnant of my wife only stared back. Answer me. What did you do? Nothing. We have to go home. We're going home. At this point, I couldn't care less if she wanted to rot on the ground along with the child that we lost. I turned and started to leave with our son, but he turned to keep the grave in view. I shuddered and chose to cover his eyes with one hand while scooping him up in the second. Say bye-bye to the baby, I told him softly. My wife lurched forward, but I had just enough time to break into a sprint myself. I'm generally faster than her, but carrying 40 pounds in one arm did not help. What do you want? I yelled back. Only audible breaths came from her as she continued her pursuit. Stop. You're scaring him. You're scaring me. I started running down the hill, back towards the pond, when something caught my foot. I dropped my son, arms naturally coming out to try and stabilize myself, but I still ended up tumbling down the hill. By the time I reoriented, she had him again. No. Stop. What are you trying to do? I stumbled back up the hill, and this time, I used my full weight to knock her onto the ground, inadvertently pulling our son down with her, but leaving her pinned under me. She screamed and squirmed and tried to bite, legs kicking any way they could, nails digging into whatever part of me she could reach. Our son finally seemed to come out of his trance and began crying at the unsightly events before him. Look what you're doing. I yelled at her, but she just continued to writhe. Dad. Stop it, Dad. You're hurting my mama, the little voice screamed, and he started hitting and kicking me as well. Look what you're doing. I repeated, voice breaking. Look what you're letting this do to us. You can't bring the dead back to life, and you're destroying your relationships with the living. She finally went still, though our child continued to fight for his mama with all of his might. I slowly rolled off her and hugged our son tightly. I'm sorry, I whispered. We all got up slowly, but my wife went right back in the direction of the tiny gravestone and hung low. I took my son by the hand and we headed home,